In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
A very good evening and a warm welcome to you to the 24th edition of We Make the City Reset, according to Roman Krznaric. Well, the year just started, but we're still in a lockdown situation, as we all know, because of the COVID-19 virus. Times are uncertain, but can we take this space to think about a complete reset of dysfunctional systems? Dysfunctional systems that in sometimes disrupts our society. In this series, we showcase the perspective of a variety of thought leaders who will reflect on our present-day situation. Because in times of crises, it's the creatives, the philosophers, scientists, creators, and designers who can visualize new scenarios and develop insights for our new future. Today, our main guest is Roman Krznaric. He will talk about how to be a good ancestor for future generations. And later on in the program, we will be joined by Daan Roovers, who will reflect on the presentation that Roman will give us. Daan, to start with her, is a Dutch philosopher and lecturer in public philosophy at the University of Amsterdam. At the end of March 2019, she became the Thinker Laureate of the Netherlands. Daan, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much.
Like I said in my introduction, you're the current Thinker Laureate of the Netherlands.
Yes.
For the people who do not know exactly what that means, can you please enlighten us?
Well, Thinker Laureate is an honorary title granted by some colleagues to me for a few years, and that's an opportunity to stress or to focus on the beauty and the importance and the urgence of philosophy in our world. So take the stage and talking about philosophy as much as you can.
Mm-hmm. And it's also the case that you would like to make philosophy more accessible for a broader public.
Yes.
Why is that necessary?
Because I think philosophy is not an academic subject in the first place. It is also an academic subject, but it started with critical thinking on what it means to live in a world like this, or what did it mean in a world to live like the ancient Greeks? To think about politics, morals, decision-making. That's what philosophy is.
Right. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But in a moment, we'll kick off the presentation of Roman Krznaric. You know each other?
Yes.
Are you friends?
I think so, yes.
We'll check that later with him as well.
Yeah.
But you read his book, The Good
Yes.
Ancestor. What do you expect from his presentation?
Well, I think he's one of the most impressive speakers I know, because he can, in a very short time, give such an intense and dense, rich talk with ideas. So I think it would be wonderful.
Great. Well, without any further ado, I would like to welcome Roman Krznaric. Roman, are you there?
I am absolutely here in my garden office in Oxford.
Great. Well, that's quite a setup, so expectations are high. Unfortunately, you couldn't join us because you are located in the UK. In a moment, you will give the presentation based on your book. I will introduce you properly so we know who we have in front of us. Roman, you're a public philosopher and you write about the power of ideas to change society. People may also know you because you're one of the founders of the School of Life. In your latest book that we talked about already, The Good Ancestor, in Dutch translated as De Goede Voorouder, you would talk about our incapability of long-term thinking. Where did the idea of the book come from?
Well, it partly came out of an absolute frustration that I keep picking up newspapers or reading media reports saying, oh, there's too much short-term thinking. We just need more long-term thinking, whether it was people in public health or people talking about technology or climate change. And probably like Daan would do too, I stopped and thought, well, what is long-term thinking? Are there different kinds of long-term thinking? Is it always good for us? So I really wanted to deal with my frustration and in a way do an anatomy of the idea of long-term thinking and make it as practical as possible.
Right. I mean, you will tell us a little bit later in the program as well, but is society geared up to for us to have long-term ideas, because everything's geared to the short term?
Well, that is actually at the crux of my book. Of course, we're looking at our phones on average 110 times a day. And people say to me, it's impossible for us to become long-term thinkers as individuals or politically. And there are so many challenges to that. But I've exactly written my book to, in a way, bring together all the best examples I can find of long-term thinking to show us that we can really do this. We have a capacity to think beyond the here and now.
Right. And before we kick off with your presentation, fact is that this idea took many shapes. How did you end up with this book in the end?
Well, I actually went to the Austrian Alps and I sat on top of a mountain for some weeks trying to think about what long-term thinking is. And in the beginning, I thought there were hundreds of different kinds of long-term thinking. And I wasn't sure whether it was always good for us, but over time, I managed to bring them down into a manageable form. I don't know why, but all my books seem to talk about 6 different kinds of empathy or 7 different kinds of love or something like that. And it's happened again with this book on being Good Ancestor. It's really focused on 6 different ways to think long term.
Great. Well, I have to say that when you talked about the Austrian Alps, I pictured you as Nurse Maria from The Sound of Music, singing to the mountains when finally the idea hit you. That's probably not the truth, is it?
Not really, but I was eating a lot of apple strudel, which he's doing a lot in The Sound of Music.
Great. Well, without any further ado, I would like to ask you to present your ideas to us. So the floor is yours, Roman.
Thank you very much for that. Well, I guess the place to begin here, of course, is that we live in an age of chronic short-termism. We know our politicians can't see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet, that businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report, that markets spike, then crash in speculative bubbles, and nations, are sitting around all those international conference tables, arguing away while the planet burns and species disappear. And of course, as I've said, we are looking at our phones and clicking that buy now button constantly. And I think it's clear that we live in an age of the tyranny of the now, and that we urgently need to press the reset button on the 2020s and start making it the decade of being the good ancestor, an age of becoming a long-term thinker. And it's clear that we need this. We need long-term thinking to deal with public health issues like the long-term mental health impacts of COVID-19 or planning for the next pandemic that might be on the horizon. We need it to deal with technological risks, such as the risks from artificial intelligence or bioweapons. We need it to deal with racial injustice and wealth inequalities that get passed on from generation to generation and that are embedded in criminal justice systems. And of course, we need long-term thinking to deal with the global ecological crisis, with climate change, with biodiversity loss, with ocean acidification, with soil degradation. And in a way, there is a tension or a paradox here that the need for long-term thinking is incredibly urgent. We need it right here, right now. And the way I think about this is that I believe humankind has colonized the future. We see the future, particularly in Western wealthy countries, we see the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And it's a bit like the way when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th century, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius. They treated the continent as if it was uninhabited. There were no people there. Of course, there was the indigenous population. And now I think we've moved from an age of terra nullius. There's still these struggles going on against this idea that there were no people in Australia, but we also now have the idea of tempus nullius. We see the future as nobody's time and similarly uninhabited territory that it's ours for the taking. And the tragedy is that future generations aren't here to challenge this pillaging of their inheritance. They can't stage a sit-in like a civil rights activist or go on a salt march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi. They're given no political rights or representation. They have no influence in the marketplace. And it can be quite difficult to grasp the real scale of this injustice. So look at it this way. There are 7.7 billion people alive today. And over the last 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died. But both of these are far outweighed by the nearly 7 trillion people who will be born over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates level off and stabilize. I mean, in the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born. Amongst them, all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. And there's a real question of, well, what legacy are we going to leave for those generations to come? And of course, we have inherited very positive legacies from the past, the legacies of the cities we still live in or the medical discoveries we benefit from. But we are also the inheritors of very negative legacies, legacies of slavery and colonialism and racism, creating deep inequities that must now be repaired. And of course, both Britain, the Netherlands, countries like that have these colonial legacies. We have also inherited legacies of economies that are structurally addicted to fossil fuels and endless growth that must now be transformed. So there is this real question of what legacy we're going to pass on to those generations to come. And someone who really thought about this issue was the immunologist Jonas Salk, who back in the 1950s developed the first polio vaccine. And he famously said in later life that the great question facing society is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by those generations to come? And he believed that if we were going to be remembered well, we would need to expand our time horizons. Instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we need to think on a scale of decades, centuries, and even millennia. Now, you may be wondering, is it even possible for human beings to do this? Well, there are countless examples of inspiring long-term thinking projects led by what I think of as time rebels, people dedicated to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice. You find them in the scientific sphere, like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last 1,000 years, preserving the world's plant biodiversity. You also find examples, for instance, in the cultural realm, in the arts. For example, the Scottish artist Katie Patterson's 100-year Future Library art project, where every year for a century, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain completely secret and unread in the Future Library until the year 2114, when the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees which have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. Now, the first person to donate a book was the Canadian writer Margaret Atwood. Elif Shafak, the Turkish writer, and many others have donated books since. But just think, Margaret Atwood is never going to meet any of those readers. She's never going to see that book published in her lifetime. So it really raises a question for all of us: is what kind of legacy gifts do we want to leave to those generations to come beyond our own lifetimes? Now, the way I think about this is there is a question, well, how do we become long-term thinkers, engage in projects like this on the personal or political level? Well, in my book, The Good Ancestor, I talk about the idea of a tug of war for time going on in society between 6 drivers of short-termism and 6 ways to think long-term. Now, some of the drivers of short-termism are very familiar: the idea of digital distraction or political presentism, the way politicians are locked into short-term electoral cycles. There are more unusual ones, for example, the idea of the tyranny of the now, which is the way that the invention of the mechanical clock in Europe in the 14th century began a process of speeding up time and eradicating the future. You know, by 1700, most clocks had minute hands. By 1800, they had second hands. The clock became the key instrument of the Industrial Revolution, speeding up the factory assembly line. And of course, now we've speeded it up even further with nanosecond speed share trading. So they're those drivers of short-termism matched by 6 ways to think long-term. I want to mention today just 2 of them to you. One is the idea of intergenerational justice, and the second is cathedral thinking. So starting with cathedral thinking, well, that is the idea of embarking on projects with very long time horizons, stretching decades or even centuries ahead, named, of course, after the great medieval cathedral builders who began building those cathedrals and religious buildings, recognizing they may not even be finished within their own lifetimes. I mean, Greta Thunberg has famously said we need cathedral thinking to deal with the climate crisis, but cathedral thinking comes in many different varieties. Of course, you've got the religious buildings like Ulm Minster in southwest Germany that you can see there, which was begun in the year 1377 when the citizens of Ulm decided they wanted their own cathedral, finance it themselves. Well, they didn't finish for more than 500 years until 1890, probably the world's longest crowdfunding project. On the right-hand side, you can see the sewers that were built in London in the 19th century after a famous event called the Great Stink of 1858. Until then, raw sewage was being dumped in the Thames River. Tens of thousands of people a year were dying of cholera, but the smell was so bad in 1858, even members of parliament couldn't breathe in the House of Commons. They had to have masks over their faces like they've got on now. And they passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers, but the sewers were built with long-term vision using expensive bricks and cement. And the great engineer, so Joseph Bazalgette, who's standing at the top in the top hat on the right-hand side, he built the sewers twice as big as they needed to be. That's why they are still used today. This was long-term cathedral thinking, or sewer thinking, as I like to think of it. Of course, in the Netherlands, you've got your own versions of this. For example, the polders, some of which are dating back to the middle of the 16th century. That's all about long-term thinking. But the bottom image in the bottom left-hand corner is a reminder that cathedral thinking is also about social and political movements which embark on long-term visioning and action. So in the civil rights movement in the United States, or the women's movement, or movements for indigenous rights, these are often struggles which don't go on for weeks or months. They go on for years and even decades, sometimes half a century long. So there are all these examples of cathedral thinking, and they're inspiring. They tell us something very vital, which is we have this capacity to think long term. But cathedral thinking isn't always good for us. It can be put towards very narrow and self-serving ends. Just think of the political regime in North Korea that wants to preserve its power from family generation to family generation. Hitler wanted an 1,000-year Reich. That's cathedral thinking too. Or consider the corporate world. A former head of the investment bank, Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, once said, "We're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy." Well, clearly that kind of long-term thinking is very narrow. It's not helping all of those future generations, people or planet, in that big orange circle. So we need to join the idea of cathedral thinking, which by itself isn't good enough, with something else. And that one of those key ideas is the idea of intergenerational justice, which is about our moral and political obligations to those generations of the future. How do we inject long-term thinking into our political decision-making structures? Now, there's some really interesting examples around, like Wales, for example, has a Future Generations Commissioner. But I'm really inspired by the Native American idea of seventh generation decision-making. Here's a wonderful quote from Chief Oren Lyons from the Onondaga Nation, which is part of the Iroquois peoples in North America. He says, "We are looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given us as chiefs, to make sure every decision that we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that is the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation?" Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's indigenous culture in North America. Of course, the seventh generation idea can be found in the Moluccas Islands as well, in village councils and many other places. But is it really relevant for a fast-moving city like Rotterdam or Miami or Dubai or Shanghai? Well, what's fascinating is that this idea, this seventh generation principle thinking, is being put into political practice in all sorts of places around the world. There's an organization in the US called Our Children's Trust, which is directly inspired by the seventh generation decision-making principle and is leading legal cases on behalf of the 21 young people you can see there who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. They filed landmark legal suits against the US federal government and the state government to claim the rights of future generations and to challenge the fossil fuel industry. And Our Children's Trust cases have inspired lawsuits worldwide. These are real David versus Goliath struggles, very difficult stuff, but they have inspired lawsuits in Uganda and in Colombia, and in fact have been partly inspired the famous Urgenda case in the Netherlands, which of course is all about campaigning for rights in relation to carbon emission reductions and the rights of current and future generations. So I think these legal struggles are really fundamental. And of course, there are also legal struggles going on to grant legal personhood to the living world, to nature itself. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Wanganui River has been given legal personhood, legal rights the same as a person, or the Ganges River in India. So these legal struggles are really fundamental. But another place where the seventh generation decision-making principle has been put into practice is in Japan, where there is this amazing movement called Future Design, again, directly influenced by the Native American seventh generation idea. And the way Future Design works is it's all about local government decision-making. They invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they typically divide them into two groups. Half of them are told their residents from the present day. The other half are given these almost ceremonial robes to wear, like kimonos, the orange robes you can see there, and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060, so 40 years in the future. It turns out the residents from 2060 systematically advocate for far more transformative and radical city plans, from healthcare investment to climate change action, to responding to COVID, to dealing with artificial intelligence. And this movement, Future Design, is now spreading across Japan, from small towns to major cities like Kyoto. It's even being used in Japan's Ministry of Finance. Now, this is really a citizen assembly form of decision-making, going back to the ancient Greek idea of participatory democracy. And I'd love to see this spreading to other countries across Europe and the Netherlands, Belgium, and elsewhere, building on the great movement for a citizens' assembly that's also already been emerging in the last 10 years. There have been citizen assemblies in Ireland, very successfully in Belgium, in Spain, and in other countries too. So let's bring Future Design into decision-making today. But if you stand back, where are we today? I think we're still at a stage where human time horizons are very much being focused on the realm of seconds and minutes. We're clicking that buy now button, we're on the stock market, we're engaged in 24/7 news, and we need to expand time horizons in both public life and personal life to that level of decades, centuries, and millennia. It's not just about saving for your pension as an individual, that of course is on the layer of decades, but it is about engaging in long-term social and ecological struggles. It's about building flood defenses, something the Dutch know all about, of course, planting trees, starting seed banks, thinking of other ways that you can bring long-term thinking into your personal life, but also your workplace, your church, your community center, wherever it happens to be. And I believe that, of course, I recognize we are at a moment of immediate crisis in today's world. COVID-19, other long-term unemployment, all sorts of other crises going on. But crises, of course, are moments for opportunity. We know this historically, that out of the crisis of the Second World War, for example, came pioneering long-term institutions from the World Health Organization to the European Union. Now is the movement to press reset on the 2020s. Let's begin this decade again. Let's become the good ancestors that future generations deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roman. And Daan, I have to say, you didn't exaggerate at all. You're a brilliant speaker. We all know that, but you've proven it again. So thank you so much. In regard to what you said, I've got a couple of questions. To regard the future not as tempus nullius, but to prepare ourselves for future and for future generations, crises like you ended your conversation with are a good opportunity for a complete reset. But I'm a bit worried about that, because if we look at crises and the collective memory of humankind, we tend to forget a lot. If we see the crisis that we had, the banking crisis, where we said this should restructure our economic system completely, where Occupy stimulated us to do that. Now, a couple of years later, nothing has changed. So the COVID-19 crisis will not be used to change anything, because as a humankind, we're not able to do that. What would your reaction to that be?
That's a great question. Well, I think the first thing about crises is that they don't always have positive outcomes. Go back to the Depression in the 1930s. Well, countries went in different directions there. Some countries went towards social democracy, say in Scandinavia. Others went towards fascism. So let's not think crises are always a good thing. And then, as you say, sometimes crises, they don't create enough change, because one of the key factors here is that if you go back to that example I gave of the Great Stink of 1858 in Britain, the thing about that crisis is that it really affected not just everyday people, but it affected those in power. It affected elites, those members of parliament who couldn't even breathe. So that's one of the things about crisis, that it needs to really impact on those in power. And of course, we've seen with COVID-19 that many countries have responded either, they've dealt with the immediate crisis, but few of them are looking very long term. And often it's because it hasn't put those elites under enough pressure. Of course, some governments are taking this as a moment to kickstart long-term thinking. Paris is a good example where on the city level, the mayor is saying, okay, let's use this moment to introduce a longer-term green restructuring of the economy. Let's close down roads. Let's turn them into parks. Let's set up bicycle lanes. Other countries, of course, are not doing that, whether it's been the United States under Trump or Bolsonaro or in Brazil. So I think the key to crises, and maybe Dan would agree with me here, is that, and the thing about Occupy is that you need to have the right ideas around as well for people to pick up. You know, you need to have concepts, metaphors, movements ready to go. And of course, the thing about 2008, a lot of people said, well, there was the crisis, but the new economic models weren't around enough, ready to be picked up by people. And so you had the old system just coming back in a new form and being subsidized. So we need the big ideas. And I think they are around now. That's partly what I've tried to do in my book.
Right. Because the examples that you gave, and that's very inspiring, there are many good ideas around. But it also made me think of Malcolm Gladwell, who described, you know, the tipping point where you can head from a small movement to something that hits on a global scale. I think the ideas are around, but what do we need in order to achieve that tipping point, in order to have a global movement towards a new, better future?
That's a really fundamental question, because I'm not convinced that we are actually at that tipping point yet. But as I was doing research for this book, what really struck me was that there are so many more organizations and groups and individuals, businesses, NGOs, committed to the long term, far more than there were 20 or 30 years ago. I gave some example there from the arts and in the sciences. You find them in politics, but you find them in economics too, like the circular economy movement, the people behind pushing for donut economics in Amsterdam and Copenhagen and other places like that. And I think if you connect the dots between all these different kinds of groups who are dedicated to long-term sustainability, to thinking beyond the here and now, I think you can call them a movement. I think what's missing in a way is bringing them all into the same room and saying, you are all time rebels, you know, you are all connected, you are all doing the same thing. I think we're missing that sense of movement, but I think that the pieces are there to create a movement. Of course, I know the world is still dominated by big fossil fuel companies and tech giants and so on, but here's something really interesting. Even in the 18th century, the great Scottish political economist Adam Smith couldn't even see the Industrial Revolution happening around him. He didn't even believe it was happening. And there it was. And I think we've got this movement for long-termism emerging in the cracks. Whether it will dominate, well, and reach a tipping point, that's another matter.
Right. But hearing your story, I also do wonder, because people are sometimes caught in a catch-22. I interviewed farmers from the northern part of the Netherlands, and what they said is, you know, previous generations prepared their land for their sons, for the future generations. They prepared their land in that way that their sons could harvest from the country, from the land as well. But now, because of the economic system, they have to apply to the rules that supermarkets give them. Supermarkets are driven by profit, by low money for the farmers. When you're in that situation, you cannot say, you know, to hell with it, I'll just do whatever I want, because you have to eat, and the margins are really small. What should somebody in that situation do in order to change that around? Because it's the power of the supermarkets at the moment.
It's really challenging that. There's something very similar happening in the United Kingdom, where farmers, you know, are about to, in fact, lose all their subsidies from the European Union, and wondering how do they sustain themselves. Well, what's really fascinating, at least in the UK, and I don't know about the Netherlands, but there's a movement of a lot of traditional farmers who have been supplying supermarkets to make a kind of an existential jump to thinking about the land in a new way. And a lot of them are picking up the idea of rewilding their land. Taking it back to nature, allowing nature to come back. And that means rethinking what the land is for. It's no longer for just grazing sheep. In the UK's example, it's maybe you're bringing in ecotourism. There's all sorts of other ways in which they're having to become more sustainable financially, but I think also in a planetary sense as well. But those choices are really difficult on the individual level. For any one person, of course, they may not want to give up just dealing with the immediate crises that they're facing, you know, like having to put food on the table. But I think, like governments and like families too, we all at times we have to make big choices and we think that there's going to be a giant abyss in front of us, but sometimes there isn't. I mean, I'll give you a little example from my own life. Okay. Just a couple of weeks ago, my partner and I decided to give up our car. Our fossil fuel car we've had for 14 years. We didn't want to give it up. You know, it's so hard to take our kids to soccer matches and hockey matches and so on. But we thought we can't look ourselves in the mirror and think that we're a reasonably sustainable household. So we put our car, it's gone in for recycling. We've now switched to a local electric car club. We love our bikes best still. And it turns out we're all right, you know, that there is ground underneath our feet when we step. You know, and I know that's only a small example, but I think that this is partly about existential courage on a level and finding out new ways to be who we are and who we want to be.
Right. Existential courage and finding out who we are. Thank you so much for now. I would like to ask Daan, what's your reaction to Philip's presentation?
Well, I have a lot of reactions. Well, let's start with an experience I share with Roman, and that's being going around talking to people. You feel there's a buzz of ideas which can be connected. So my subject, my field of study is more like politics, local politics, governments, citizen assemblies. And when I'm talking to local politicians or to mayors or to every politician, I feel that there is a lot of interest, a lot of interest in new ways of making decisions and of engaging citizens in decision making. And what I found out last years is talking to mayors, talking to local politicians, that this short-termism in city politics is a very, very, very common. Well, I think cities or politics or governments are hotspots of short-termism because they only have a mandate for 4 years and they want to establish some things, they want to perform their own prestigious projects. So all these people are, when they enter the town hall after the election, they stop the projects of their predecessors and they are going to perform their own projects, which are going to be stopped in 4 years. But when you ask citizens, inhabitants of a town, to come with the politicians or to engage in decision-making, you introduce the long-termism, because inhabitants are the ones that stay in a town, and the politicians are the ones that come in and go away in a few years. So if you want to introduce more long-termism in politics, I think this citizen assembly idea is a very good idea, because inhabitants are going to stay for decades. They want the town to be a good place to stay for their children, to have a home for their children. So I think coming from politics, this idea of long-termism is very, very fruitful to shift a lot of political impact towards the citizens.
But then again, I'll ask about the scale as well, because we talked about citizens' assemblies, and it's really interesting to have their long-term vision on, you know, city development.
Yeah.
But still, it's only a small group that's been invested in a lot, where, you know, the importance of long-term thinking is introduced. But if you talk about politics, if you talk about electorates, you see that the most effective, let's say, populist politicians that are popular focus on short-term underbelly feelings and to satisfy the short-term needs of the electorate. And that system prevents, you know, a long-term vision to develop something for future. How do you deal with that? Because also citizens' assemblies are very small scale.
Yeah, well, maybe we are on a turning point, not yet, but we are coming on a turning point, because this COVID pandemic is a very good example, I think, for where you see that our Dutch government is not able to plan more than 2-3 weeks ahead. So every 2-3 weeks we get new rules, a new system, new expectancies. So I think people are are seeing that this horizon of few weeks is too short, and we're running and running behind the ball and not having any view of months, years, decades. I think this is very unsatisfying for everyone. This overexposure on the here and the now and the solving yesterday's crisis. So maybe this crisis is going to learn us something, or we can shift our minds. It's also about a mind shift in our.
And in what way should we shift it? Because I think it's too general to say we should think about future generations, because that's not really concrete. We can't imagine anything about future generations. If you could ask our grandparents what our generation would live like with our electronics, for example, or social media, they couldn't imagine it. If you talk about future generations, we cannot imagine what their needs are, what their wants are. So how can we, think for them? Isn't that impossible?
Yeah, that's a very good question, but you should ask Roman, because he has a little thought experience on that. Because it sounds very, very abstract, but he has a way to envision the future generations in a more lively way. So please ask Roman.
Roman, it's over to you. Enlighten us. How can we see my children's children's children in future, and how to preserve future for them?
Oh, okay. Well, let's do this, actually. You're going to have to do something as well. What I'd like you to do is to close your eyes for a moment, both of you and everybody listening too. And I want you to just imagine a young person in your life who you really care about. It could be a nephew or niece or one of your own children or grandchildren. Just picture their face. And now what I want you to do is to imagine them 30 years in the future. Again, picture their face. They're now 30 years older. Think about the joys that they've got in their life and the struggles that they might be having. And just hold that thought for a moment. And now I'd like you to imagine them on their 90th birthday. They're 90 years old, surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and work colleagues. Just go and have a look out the window. What kind of world is it out there? And now imagine that they are about to give a birthday speech. And instead of giving the speech, they decide to tell the room about you, their departed ancestor, and the legacy that you left them. Just think for a moment about what they might say in that birthday speech about you. And now I'd like you to open your eyes again. And in that little thought experiment, which you can do and take it more slowly at home, I think we find the answer to Daan's question and this issue of how do we connect with those future generations? Because look, when I do that experiment, I think of my daughter, who's now 12. I think of her as a 90-year-old. She could be alive in the year 2100, okay? And I think about the world she's living in. I look out that window. Is she living in a world of utopian milk and honey, or is it a world on fire? And ultimately, when I do that little thought experiment, I tell you what I learned from this, is that if I care about my daughter's life when she's 90 and the world she lives in, then I can't just care about her life. I need to care about all life, about the community she's embedded in, the people that support her, but also the web of the living world she's part of, the water she drinks and the air she breathes. In other words, thinking about our future generations on that personal level, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, is a stepping stone to a more transcendent connection with future generations. So I don't agree with this idea that we don't know anything about the future. We know absolutely what future generations need at the most basic foundational level, which is they need a planet on which they can survive, the one and only planet we know that sustains life. Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future. We don't know if the world of 2049 is going to be like Blade Runner 2049 in terms of, have the machines taken over and artificial intelligence dominating. But we do know something about what humans need to sustain themselves. So that, to me, is the answer, in a sense. We need to think about preserving place as much as thinking about time. We need to think about living within the realms of this one planet that we know and not going over its ecological boundaries.
Right. I think that personal approach to future and connect that to a much broader vision on what the world is that I thought about my daughter as well. What's the world is that she lives in is very interesting. I have to say that when I did it myself, I focused on the softer side, the values that you would hope that she would convey in future, and less on the more practical side. But it's good to have that as a starting point and broaden the views.
But it's a good connection to the future. If you care about your daughter now, you care about her future life and about her future world.
Absolutely,
so it's not that abstract anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you think about, can I just say, you know, that seventh generation idea, a lot of people think, oh, I can't think 7 generations ahead. That's too far. That's too uncertain. Well, the seventh generation idea is really about thinking, you know, 150, 200 years ahead. But you can do that with your own great-grandchildren. You know, my daughter's grandchildren will be alive in the middle of the 22nd century. That's not science fiction. That is an intimate, personal family fact.
Well, it is science fiction in a sense because, my grandparents didn't think of us, having the conversation while you were in Oxford, I'm here in Amsterdam, we use a screen in order to talk to each other. That was unfeasible. So in that sense, I do not think that I can really imagine what can happen in about 200 years and this technology asks for different kinds of needs as well, especially in the workplace where we have to work at home. So we don't have the interaction that we were used to. So the conversation that we have it while having a coffee or crossing each other in the hallways are completely different. They're not here right now, but human interaction does need that. And I wonder if, my grandparents, could have thought about that when, they were asked to think about my generation, or am I mistaken?
Well, I think you are partly mistaken in the sense, just think of in the 1870s, Australia was suddenly connected to Europe and the rest of the world by the telegraph line. And suddenly it didn't take 3 months for a message to come by ship to Australia. It only took a couple of days on using Morse code on a cable. That was the big internet revolution when the world became connected, not the one that we've had since the invention of the World Wide Web. But of course, there are things that we cannot imagine about the future. And that's why, in fact, in a way, going back to Dan's point about citizen assemblies are really important, not just because they're much better at envisioning futures than your normal politicians, because they actually do care about, what's the water system going to be like, or the education like for my children or grandchildren. That's part of it. But the thing about citizens' assemblies is that they offer a variety or a plurality of futures, because people care about different things. Some people are worried about long-term mental health. Others are worried about technology. Others are worried about climate change. Others are worried about racism. And all of those are very valid concerns about the future. So one of the problems is we don't want a platonic kind of guardian of the future who's just going to tell us exactly what we need for 50 years from now or 100 years from now, because they might be totally wrong. They might be like the Goldman Sachs executive giving a very narrow view of what the future should be. We need a plurality of voices discussing, debating, deliberating about what that future should look like. And I know Daan's done a lot of work of working with people like Michael Sandel, thinking about the power of deliberative democracy. And let's put that power of deliberative democracy to work for thinking about all those generations who have no voice. We cannot leave them out of politics any longer. It is absolutely unjust.
I think you're completely right in regard to that. I think that all voices should be heard. In that sense, moving on to the next part of our program, it's interesting to learn from your own family or your future family or your ancestors, but you brought a video clip with you as well, where we can see how we can learn from nature. Would you like to introduce that clip?
So this clip is from one of my great heroes or heroines, the American biomimicry designer and thinker Janine Benyus. And she, in this little 1-minute clip, is sending a message about long-term thinking. And it's actually one of the secrets to long-term thinking. I don't want to say too much, but it's about recognizing that to think long-term, you need to think about place as much as time.
Great. Let's have a look at the clip.
You know, the answers we seek, the secrets to a sustainable world, are literally all around us. And if we choose to truly mimic life's genius, the future I see would be beauty and abundance, and certainly fewer regrets. You know, in the natural world, the definition of success is the continuity of life. You keep yourself alive and you keep your offspring alive. That's success. But it's not the offspring in this generation. Success is keeping your offspring alive 10,000 generations and more. And that presents a conundrum because you're not going to be there to take care of your offspring 10,000 generations from now. So what organisms have learned to do is to take care of the place that's going to take care of their offspring. Life has learned to create conditions conducive to life. And that's really the magic heart of it. Life creates conditions conducive to life. And that's also the design brief for us right now. We have to learn how to do that. And luckily, we're surrounded by the answers. And, you know, millions of species willing to gift us with their best ideas.
Great. It's very inspirational, and it's very inspirational to think about 10,000 generations. I don't really like to spoil things, but I'm going to spoil it as well. If nature's not fair, we're looking for some fairness in and having every voice is heard. We just talked about that. But if I look at my garden on a very small scale, if you look what ivy does to my garden, it grows everywhere and it suffocates other plants in order to survive. And that's the way humanity now is conducting their survival. But that's not the way that we should incorporate our identity in that sense. So we shouldn't be as ivy, but should we be as nature? Isn't that a romantic idea of nature that we have?
Well, certainly there's that idea that, okay, locusts or ivy will take over a place, but actually, even in their own terms, all species are creating those conditions conducive to life. They are not destroying the ecosystem on which their sustainability is required for survival, you know. But of course, human beings, our problem, and you could say this for ivy as well, is that we have been going outside our ecological boundaries, overstepping them at an ever-increasing pace and scale over the last century. And we know it's the basis of ecological economics that if we are going to survive for the long term, we need to not use resources faster than they can naturally be replenished, and not dump wastes faster than oceans and other carbon sinks can naturally absorb them. You know, when I studied economics 30 years ago, I was showing a demand and supply diagram, but nobody ever put a circle around it, the biosphere. This is all I'm saying. And this is what Janine Benyus is saying, that if we are going to survive for the long term, whether you're a bear or a beaver or a human being or a bird, you can't destroy the ecosystem on which your sustenance is based. So you're right to raise the question of ivy, but the ivy itself isn't destroying its ecosystem. When it does, it starts retreating again, of course.
Right. Dan, I'll ask you in a second to react to it, but the final question in this regard that I would like to ask, and then I'll try not to spoil that much anymore. Isn't the basic mistake that we regard humanity to be forever? Isn't it much easier to think of humanity as a temporary thing, that, you know, we live for a couple of generations and then humanity dies? Well, that's the course of nature. We shouldn't complain about that. That's how nature goes.
Well, certainly we should recognize that humankind is just an eye blink in the cosmic story. I mean, if the age of the Earth is the distance from your nose to the tip of your outstretched hand, one stroke of a nail file on your middle finger eradicates human history. We're only here for a moment, and that might make you think, oh, well, why don't we just trash the planet? You know, we are only going to be here for a while and the Earth will go on fine after without us. Well, that's true. But what right do we have to break the great chain of life? Even if we're only here for 1 million years as a species, who are we to break that chain which goes 3.8 billion years into the past on Earth and maybe 5 or 6 billion years into the future towards the death of our sun. What kind of arrogance is it to do that? So I believe we've got an obligation to keep that chain of life in good form, nourished, regenerated.
Great. Dan, would you like to react on the video?
Yes, because I found it a very fruitful way of thinking, taking space as a concept. Where do we live? Where is my place to live? In order to rethink our ethical, moral, political view towards our surroundings. And there are a few philosophers who are doing that as well. For instance, Bruno Latour has written an essay on where can we land? Where's our place to live? And even Hannah Arendt did that in her way, but then from the respect of a refugee. But that's what I was saying in the beginning as well. Asking inhabitants to participate in politics, because if you have a place to live, you want to have that well organized. You want to preserve that for your children and for your grandchildren. So being somewhere on a place is a very good starting point for taking care of this place. So I think this biological stance is a good. Yeah. Philosophical stance as well.
Taking your surroundings in account and to preserve the surroundings in the best way you can. Thank you. Roman, you brought a second clip as well. Would you like to introduce that too?
So this is a clip of a drone flying over an incredible 3,000-year-old artwork about 20 miles from where I live in south of Oxford. It's called the White Horse of Uffington. It's a 100-meter long gigantic horse carved into the side of a mountain, and the mountain's made of chalk, so white stone, and they cut away the grass so you can see it. And basically this horse has been preserved for these 3,000 years, and for hundreds of years we know that the local villagers have gone to do something called re-chalk the horse. It's a long-term kind of ritual of looking after the horse, taking out the weeds and bashing in chalk. And I went up and join this ritual. And this is a video of us, me with a group of friends from the Long Now Foundation based in London, and we are re-chalking the horse. That's what you're going to see, long-term ritual.
Brilliant, let's have a look.
Stuff. And then the machine makes the chairs, makes the stuff.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Roman, do we understand anything why did what they did and why they created the horse?
It's one of those great mysteries. We don't know whether it was a pre-Christian kind of pagan worship of the horse or what its real purpose was. But what we do know is that those local people had this festival every year, and now anyone can go and participate in this. And it really is about preserving things. It's about asking ourselves, well, what do we want to preserve from the past? And of course, we don't want to preserve everything from the past. I don't want to preserve inequality and racism from the past. I want to preserve an incredible work of art like that, because it's about bringing long-termism and a culture of maintenance into our thinking. It's about changing what our worldviews are. And that's what this is about, really. It's about refocusing our attention on what matters. Daan just mentioned there Bruno Latour, and all his work on, for example, the Parliament of Things, for example, getting us to rethink who or what deserves a voice. How do we listen to the sea and give it a voice, for example? And, as I mentioned earlier, the idea in New Zealand, the rivers that have been given legal personhood, that's a way of starting to bring, I guess, the mechanistic, imposed world of humankind on the living world, trying to recognize the interdependence there and bashing in that stone, creating these kind of rituals are ways of breaking down those barriers between the human and the non-human, between the past and the future.
Right. Daan, as a thinker laureate, why is it important to preserve those rituals that we just saw?
Well, I think it's a very good example of breaking with the tyranny of the now and recapturing the feeling of being engaged in a long-term history and future. Mm-hmm. I think it's a very enriching experience. So we don't live in Oxford, all of us, and we can't travel right now. But we have to recapture this feeling of being of having a long-term horizons ourselves for our own lives and our own politics and our own society.
In that sense, we're talking about rituals. I mean, there are a lot of rituals, especially in other societies in Latin America, for example, where, you know, the ancestors are being, you know, attributed to know what you have right now. Yeah. Is in Western society, is there enough attention or enough focus on ancestry in order to be thankful for where you are right now? Is that a way that we should head to?
Well, I think we don't have very many rituals in Western societies because we've saying goodbye to religion, and we always said, well, we've broken with a lot of traditional things from the past, so we are all more interested in our individual doings, and there's not much space for I think rituals. But you can well, my personal favorite thing is reading, and I read books from 2,000 years ago. And when I do that, I see that as a conversation with someone from 2,000 years ago, and that's very. If you see a text from someone written before Christ and you can read it right now, that's being part of history and stretching it to a future. You don't have to have churches or temples or something like that. You can invent new rituals, but I think you have to try to connect to generations before you and generations ahead.
Right. Thank you so much for now. Roman, we're heading to the general elections here in the Netherlands. In order to sustain or prepare politics for thinking about future generations, what should we take in account when we go vote?
Well, I think the first thing you should probably do is, if you have children, give your votes to your children. This is something my partner and I did at the UK 2019 election. We sat around with our then 11-year-old twins. We debated the party manifestos, and then they told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. So if you're a parent or a grandparent or you have a nephew or niece, give them a gift. Give them your vote. You know, have a conversation with them. Make it real, you know. But I think this is a real act, but also a symbolic act, of course, about giving a voice to future generations. The second thing is, find whoever you might possibly vote for, or the other parties. Try if you can ask them in a public forum, in what way are you going to be a good ancestor? What are you doing for the year 2100? What are you doing beyond your possible parliamentary or ministerial term? I think those are the kind of questions that we can start asking. Then I think a third thing for the Netherlands, I don't know enough about Dutch politics, but you know, I think places like the Netherlands have the potential to create new public positions around future generations. It might be a future generations ombudsman or a commissioner or a citizens assembly, which is permanently there, made of young people to advise parliament, like an alternative parliament, a youth parliament or something like that. There's all sorts of things that could be done. So really this is about being creative not just by carving a white horse into the edge of a hillside, but being creative in the way we rethink our political systems.
Great. Unfortunately, our time is up right now, but thank you so much, Roman, for your presentation. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas. And if you would like to buy the book, if you're interested in the book, you can buy the Good Ancestor, or in the Dutch version, De Goede Voorouder, in every big store that is closed right now. But please order them online, because in Holland we've got a great rescue scheme done by customers in order to rescue those bookstores. So please support your local bookstore. And it's a great recommendation. Thank you so much, Daan, as well, for sharing your stories. Like I said, we've come to the end of the program. Next week, we will be back with WeMakeThe.City Reset. And then we will be back with co-founder of Studio Monarch, Edwin Gardner, and his guest, author of The End of Night, Searching for Natural Darkness in an Age of Artificial Light, Paul Bogart. Again, thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time. If you would like to support our programs, please do so. You can go to the website where you can see the programs of Pakhuis de Zwijger. But if you go to www.dezwijger.nl/pay, you can support us by leaving a financial contribution. And those will benefit the programs directly in these dire times. Again, thank you so much, Roman, for sharing your stories. And I hope to meet you in real life soon. Thank you so much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.